Okay, good evening and welcome to the October event of the Nottingham and Derby branch of the BCS. This evening we are going to listen to a talk about protection or privacy. It's a joint event with CISEC Nottingham, Derby and Leicester branch, and we'll learn more about CISEC shortly. Some netiquette before we start. Obviously the speakers will be speaking, but keep your microphones off. If you can direct any questions in the chat window, please, and also questions as we go through the talk that can be picked up later. Obviously, some of that we don't need to worry about. For our inclusion and diversity purposes, could I ask you all if you can respond to this questionnaire, please? You can either use the URL that's at the bottom, which we'll post in the chat window shortly, or if you've got your phone to hand, if you can use the QR code. I'll just leave that there for a few moments. Details about the group and our future events and such are available on the website. Obviously, it's quite a long URL. We'll repost that in the chat window shortly. This will show you all of the events that we've got coming up and more details about the branch and the committee. Our next webinar will be 15th of November. And what has enterprise architecture brought us? If you've not already registered, please do so. You can use the QR code, or also the details are on our website. I'd now like to hand over to Colin Robbins of CISEC, who will introduce tonight's event.
Okay. Thank you, Matt. Yeah, so first of all, just for those of you not aware, introduce CISEC, which is the Chartered Institute of Information Security. And so this is one of a series of joint events that we've run with the BCS in the Nottingham, Derby and Leicester area. The CISEC branch has been running for a number of years now. And it's really trying to provide a local network of trusted security professionals, so that we know people in the area that we can contact to and turn for help when we hit particular security challenges in our organisations. And we've like to do that through regional branch meetings, which obviously for obvious reasons have now moved online. But as soon as we can get back to face-to-face meetings, we'll be trying to do that, so that we can really establish that those peer contacts and help each other to solve some of today's security challenges. So I'll move on to talk about tonight's event. So if you could move to the next slide, please. Thank you, Matt. So we've advertised this as really talking about privacy or protection, and the reason we've come about this is there does seem to be a number of times in our discussions that we have as security professionals, we kind of come across this dichotomy of how do I manage both users' right to a private life and keep their own personal communications private, versus the corporate view of I need to scan everything because I need to make sure data is not leaking out of my organization. I need to scan things coming in to make sure that there's not malware. Or there's the consumer companies in which your data is a commodity. And so there's a number of sort of challenges there. So we thought that we would run this event as a debate. And so the way we, sorry, if you could move to the next screen, please. So we're going to run this as first of all, two opening statements from Peter and Ashley, and I will introduce them a bit more in a moment. And then after their opening statements, sort of 5 minutes each, I'm then going to use the questions, the 7 questions that were on the previous screen. As a security manager, I, as a CIO, I, as a data protection officer, I am worried about, or whatever it is. So going to use those 7 questions to direct the debate for 15 to 20 minutes. We had that initial list of roles up there, but if you as the audience have a specific role that you think is pertinent to the discussion that you would like to throw in, but please add that into the chat along the lines as a, whatever the role is, I would like to be able to, and then we will seek Ashley and Peter's views on that. And then after about 20 minutes, we'll see where the debate takes us, and most importantly, where the questions in the chat then take us. And so I'll use the questions from the chat to do that. So opening statements about 5 minutes each, 20 minutes of role-based discussion exploring those issues, and then a general discussion. So to start off, as I say, we're going to have a presentation from Peter and Ashley. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Peter Wood. So Peter is a member of both CISEC and the BCS, and currently works for Naturally Cyber LLP. And in his bio, Peter says he founded his first UK cybersecurity firm in 1989, which is a really interesting year, because that's the year I started working for Nexel. So like to invite Peter to provide your opening remarks, please.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you, and good evening, everybody, if you're watching us live, and hello if you're watching us recorded. My role this evening is to play the part of a user who has privacy concerns, or an organization that may be hoping to gain traction through promoting privacy. So the views I express tonight may or may not be my own, a phrase I stole from Ashley because he's a lawyer. And I think hopefully you'll find them interesting views, but they don't necessarily reflect my own or my company's. So next slide, please. Bosh, thank you. So I have 2 slides, and I'm going to try and limit myself to 5 minutes. So I have my eye on the clock. Slide 1 is a set of reasons why privacy is important to me, lifted with complete transparency from Daniel J. Solove, who is a very reputable source. I'm not going to read the slide to you, but I am going to read some of the cogent arguments behind each of these 10 points. So forgive me while I use a piece of paper to do so I don't misquote Daniel. The limit on power is about personal data can be used to affect our reputations, and it can be used to influence our decisions and shape our behavior. It can be used as a tool to exercise control over us, and in the wrong hands, personal data can be used to cause us great harm. So that's the first reason. Each of these reasons is of a similar justification for privacy in the extreme. Respect for individuals. If a person has a reasonable desire to keep something private, it is disrespectful to ignore that person's wishes without a compelling reason to do so. Thirdly, privacy enables people to manage their reputations. How we are judged by others affects our opportunities, friendships, and overall well-being. Knowing private details about people's lives doesn't necessarily lead to more accurate judgment about those people. Fourthly, we need places of solitude to retreat to, places where we are free of the gaze of others in order to relax and feel at ease. Most people don't want everyone to know everything about them, hence the phrase, none of your business. Fifthly, and for me quite poignantly, in relationships, whether personal, professional, governmental or commercial, we depend upon trusting the other party. Breaches of confidentiality are breaches of that trust. As I will explore subsequently, a lack of privacy can very easily lead to a breach of information. Sixthly, personal data is essential to so many decisions made about us, from whether we get a loan, a license, a job, to our personal and professional reputations. Without having knowledge of what data is being used, how it's being used, the ability to correct and amend it, we're virtually helpless in today's world. Seventh, privacy is key to freedom of thought. A watchful eye over everything we read or watch can chill us from exploring ideas outside the mainstream. We may want to criticize people we know to others, yet not share that criticism with the world. Privacy helps protect our ability to associate with other people and engage in political activity. A key component of freedom of political association is the ability to do so with privacy if one chooses. Penultimately, people are not static, they change and grow throughout their lives. There is a great value in the ability to have a second chance, to be able to move beyond a mistake, to be able to reinvent oneself. Privacy nurtures this ability. And lastly, an important reason why privacy matters is not having to explain or justify oneself. We may do a lot of things which, if judged from afar by others, lacking complete knowledge or understanding, may seem odd or embarrassing or worse. It can be a heavy burden if we constantly have to wonder how everything we do will be perceived by others and have to be at the ready to explain. Next slide, please. So some practical issues I concocted of my own based on some of those precepts. Of course, if I can't keep everything private, what if the organization or the entity which is intercepting my communications has itself a breach of my information, leaving me vulnerable to, for example, identity theft? Ditto, breaching that information could leave me open to data harvesting, and I'm vulnerable to a bunch more interesting activities that large and independent entities might deploy. Privacy of something like GPS tracking expose me when I don't want to be exposed, and I may be physically unsafe, or my family may be. I need privacy in the mobile apps, those that I choose to use and those that I don't, because my data is my data and not yours. And lastly, in GDPR, there is a right to be forgotten, and data privacy is a human right as a result. So that's my posit. Next, please.
Thank you, Peter. So going to next ask Ashley to give his opening remarks. Whereas Peter has played the privacy side of that, Ashley is going to replay the other side of why that is really useful data. So Ashley is a partner at Mishcon de Rea, and I do hope I've pronounced that correctly. He is also a member of CISEC and chairman of the Data Protection Forum. I won't read the other elements out. You can see that for yourself. So yeah, over to you, Ashley.
Thank you, Colin. And happily, I think I've been a member of the BCS since the mid-90s, if not earlier, but not a very active member, unfortunately. So very pleased to be here. I'm going to take the role, if I may, of the Bond villain of data. So for which I will need a high-backed chair and a white cat to stroke. And for these purposes, you need to imagine that over the last 20 or so years in which I've been advising on privacy law, I've advised many of the large, often Californian platforms who do things or to your data. And therefore, in some respects, rather than being seen to be a privacy lawyer, I am, in fact, an anti-privacy lawyer. And for the purpose of this discussion, I'll just give you a bit of an insight as to why I think corporates might have a differing view from Professor Solov, which Peter's mentioned a moment ago. Professor Solov is a very nice chap, actually. I've spoken to his conferences a number of times. And if I make any remarks against academics, they're certainly not targeted at him. Let's look at the next slide. Just to say, when you read the stuff on the internet, of which there is masses, generally about privacy, a lot of it is written by academics in general. And it's my experience that the sort of viewpoint they will take is often a very pro-individual viewpoint. My world is actually the view of the corporate, and strangely enough, they don't publish exactly their plans as to what they do with data, so you don't get to read their side of the story very much. And so here, I just want to share a couple of slides with you to start to set off the thinking as to privacy and how they might treat it. So let me start off by saying that numbers, of course, are really important. So the starting point is, I think it was become as a very pleasing surprise to large corporates that personal data and large databases has a real value. And I remember this being discussed even as a young lawyer in the mid-90s, because we had a couple of catalog companies up for sale. And in the sale of those businesses, the values were ascribing a value to each kind of set of names and addresses on their database. You know, we had a mailing list of so many hundreds of thousands of people, and they were to ascribe a value to that. Remember, this is the era, as you may remember, where cornflake packets came with a little box in the corner, and you used to try and cut that coupon out without letting the cornflakes out, and then you'd fill it in, send it in, and the cornflake company would send you a useless toy, but it would have your name and address. And so in that world, even that list of data had a value. Now in the 90s, the OECD, and there's a picture here from a very handy OECD report I would commend you to, which talks about a number of various validation methodologies. And it shows that there's actually been quite a lot of thinking about how you value large amounts of data. But from a legal perspective, the big change has come from, this was originally a discussion of intellectual property. You know, did you have a license to this information? How much would it cost you to license in a comparable database? To a question of personal data. Do you have the right to use that data in the way that you anticipate? And looking at the applications of Data Protection Act and GDPR. Let's move on to the next slide. So from a business perspective, you know that the personal data has value, and you justify it in some quite easy ways. You say, well, look, surely customers don't mind providing us with personal data because by return they get free stuff. And this statement is extraordinarily still true, if not ever more so today. If you think about the sheer computing costs of providing search on the internet, or of providing free email or webmail, or of providing social messaging services, these are really expensive, complex systems to provide, and we get them for nothing. And we get them for nothing because our data is used as part of behavioral advertising to provide us with targeted adverts. That is the bargain. And if you look at a whole bunch of various surveys on that, you tend to find that the surplus, the amount that people would pay for that, given the option of, subscription service or carrying what you've got, actually, they're happy to give away their personal data for a really small amount of money. And therefore, it still represents really good value for them to receive these services. Another way to justify it is, well, look, has it really changed from what customers enjoyed before? If you went to your favorite shop or go down to your local pub, assuming it's still open, and you know the landlord, they know what your preferences are. They know what beer you like to drink. They know what you like to shop for. in a way, the technology companies are just seeking to give you that same personalization, but on a grander scale. And it was certainly not offensive for shopkeepers to know who we were, or for bartenders and landlords to know which drinks we like. Lastly, the companies know that even the technology used for that profiling has value in itself. So it's not just the data now that's got value, but the technology around it. And so this is now an important part of that game of increasing value to your business by making sure you have good data, large data sets, and really nice technology to run over it. On the next slide, I just wanted to make this point about law. So once upon a time, people thought that the word compliance was kind of a binary choice, that you were either compliant with the law or you were not. Now, whilst that is certainly absolutely still true for a number of areas or a number of sectors, that is perhaps not true in relation to data protection and privacy compliance. It's a spectrum of compliance. And as I would argue, there's a prudent business, you decide where along that spectrum you want to be. And obviously, if you're not at the fully compliant end of the spectrum, you're assuming some risk. So it's a trade-off between risk and reward. If you don't, and so for many businesses, that balance is the best place. The best objective, a balanced position is the best place to get to in relation to your compliance generally. Now you might say, well, let's look at some of these giant social media platforms that we've had over the last 10 years. Perhaps they didn't comply as fully with the law as they might have done when they were smaller. And maybe you're right. And we can see in some cases that they're paying the price for those speed bumps or speeding tickets they had when they were younger companies. But you can also argue they maybe wouldn't have got to the size and scale they have now if they did comply with every last bit of the GDPR as fastidiously as some people recommend. So in that risk analysis, let's just have a look at those risks, because you need to know that to understand where along this spectrum you're going to be. Regulatory action. Well, the much promised 4% of worldwide turnover fines, as we were all horrified about in 2017 and 2018, does not appear to have materialized. The vast number of fines, which we were told was coming, also does not appear to have materialized. I'm sure some bright spark can catalogue all the number of fines and divide it against the number of companies that have suffered those fines, and divide it against the number of operating companies with sizable data sets. And you can see on a risk basis to what extent you might be fined. I suspect that number is quite low. We also know how vigorous the regulators are. You know, how likely are they to bring enforcement action? And you can read that from their annual reports, and still the numbers are quite low. So before I shoot you all to the take lots of risk with the GDPR as your proposal, let's look at litigation. Class actions in particular are extremely expensive. Where they're funded, they are pretty much driven by wealthy companies who would like to, or funds who would like to make money. And so you do need to keep an eye out on your risk analysis as to your exposure to litigation generally. That certainly moves the needle to the right. And then lastly on the slide for your risk analysis, obviously reputation and brand damage, people understand. Damage to the share price, well, that's interesting. I did often wonder whether when we saw these large breaches, where we'd see, you know, huge shifts in the share price to which it wouldn't recover. And if you do that analysis, strangely, there is not, or has not been, these huge shifts in share price. But you then look to customer churn. Will you see a higher degree of turnover with breaches? Well, you can look back to some good English breaches and see that whilst there's been initial downturn, no lasting damage seems to be done there. But of course, lastly, if you have a bit of a reputation that you can't keep data secure or you're not in compliance with the law, that gives you a further uphill battle for acquiring customers. So for our discussion today, I'm going to be taking the position of the corporate, the anti-privacy lawyer, and to see how that reflects in the various circumstances we've got later on.
Thank you, Ashley. And yeah, I've seen that there's some questions coming in already, so please do keep those coming. I'll return to those in a moment. The discussion so far has had Peter very much about your right as an individual and wanting to keep things private, and Ashley, your sort of count or other view of that is very much from that data, that corporate that is using that data to generate value and offer services. But I'd like to just sort of briefly explore, though, the other corporate role, which is this is the business I work for, and so within that business, maybe as the CFO, I really like this idea of bring your own device. That's fantastic. But that seems to me to offer this real horrible balance in the middle, that Peter as a user, he's got his mobile phone, he'll be accessing, selecting which data he will share with which of these companies, but based on however chooses to do that. But you as CFO now, to enable that bring your own device, will be, your security people will be hugely worried that, hold on a minute, now my corporate data is going to be on this phone, and Peter's going to share that anywhere. You can put that on social media, and I've got no controls over that. So corporates now want to start putting control barriers in between those. So we'd be interested in both your sort of reactions to that. I guess initially, from Peter's point of view, to be able to work efficiently and use your favorite toys, your company's going to have to scan everything you do.
I don't think they do. I think the answer is to sandbox appropriately, dividing, if you like, the functionality of the device between work and private. And if that's done efficiently and well and respects the privacy of the individual, then I think appropriate controls can be put in place.
Okay, and Ashley, is that enough? You invest in technology to segregate all of this?
Yeah, I think there's some real risks with bring your own devices that even as a person that likes to enjoy taking risks here, we need to think about. People seem to talk about them in terms of that classic ability of, can you delete the corporate data if the device is lost or stolen? And yeah, that could be done, and that's very sensible. But there's some bigger risks that I think that you need to keep an eye on before rolling out BYOD. And the principal one there is litigation holds. If your company is subject to litigation, then you have an absolute duty to preserve all of the data in the business that's material to the litigation, including the data on that device that's in that corporate segment, so it can't be deleted. And I'm not entirely certain that the technology we have today allows that. The second problem litigation holds, as you know, for many investigations we've seen, whether it's LIBOR or interest rates, whatever it might be, is that the courts will also want to see any private messaging that can take place or has material information. It's not the hold and the discovery is not exclusively restricted to just the quotes and quotes corporate devices you've got, but all devices. So even though I'm kind of pro-risk, BYOD does worry me a bit, just because you can't comply with that litigation hold requirement.
Okay, thank you. So again, Peter, I think in your introduction, you talked about the freedom of thought, and not having to explain yourself. But again, how does that tally with, again, corporate systems where you're using things like email, collaboration platforms, etc., where company might well be scanning that to make sure that the communications that you are putting into those platforms are compliant with fair use policies and all of those kind of things. So again, if you're going to use those platforms, your own company is going to want to scan all of that stuff.
Yes, it is. I understand that. I'm still playing this role, by the way. And I would suggest that the right thing to do would be to have a contractual relationship with me as the employee, so that I have a right to see what's being intercepted, and more importantly, what's being retained, and to be able to object to information being retained if I believe it is contrary to some of the basic principles in which I believe.
And Ashley?
Well, this is a really good topic, and it's interesting because I think many companies like to think they're doing the right thing in relation to scanning of either communications going in or out. But the reality is, I'm not sure that they are. I mean, there's already taking a huge amount of risk here they perhaps don't appreciate. The fundamental problem is that unlike in the US, you can't just simply say everything that you do at work is absolutely owned by the company. You have no personal rights over it. If you want to do your own personal stuff, do it on your own devices and tough. That, for me, sounds a very naturally sensible approach, but data protection law does not permit that. And you still enjoy data protection rights in relation to those personal correspondence. The difficulty is that for many companies, even if you look at the sort of scanning that's being done in practice and has been done for many years, and then look at the employee privacy notice, where you're supposed to tell the employees the scanning that you do, I rarely see a good matchup between those two positions. In reality, your business is going to be doing scanning through encrypted communications. You're going to have analysis of communications of between various employees. You'll spot who's having an affair in the office or similar. You'll be looking at not just incoming content, but content reflected through the business. And so you'll be looking at the data protection rights of third parties who are not in the business. So they're looking at their personal data. So there's loads of analysis of data that happens in practice that is not properly reflected in the employee privacy notice or your website privacy notice. So where are we? It means that we are all presently, in my view, in breach of privacy laws in that regard. And that's the norm. And I think that's really pretty much how it will continue until we get a major lawsuit against one or other of us for infringing the rights of the employee. Do you want to be the first company to break out of that standard mold and start being really clear about the scanning that actually does take place against our employees, and to give them exactly the rights that they are due under the GDPR? I'm not sure we want to be that first person.
So Peter, what do you feel about that? The companies are scanning it anyway. You don't really care whether you're bothered by it.
Yeah, well, that'll enter into the most fraught area that in my real life I encountered frequently, which is the employee, even at a moderately senior level, who has a belief that the company will behave in what he or she considers to be a moral way, and the high-level decision makers who may have an eye more on the bottom line than any particular moral position. So I think there is, I agree it's where we are. However, I do believe that there should be some opportunity for the employee to have sight of what's being recorded so that they could challenge it. And I think that may be what's missing.
Well, I think that the employees probably do have that right. I mean, they can exercise DSARs against their employers and to ask what information is provided. You tend to find that's exercised most frequently for departing employees, particularly ones that have departed in unhappy situations. Whether they really get all the right information is another question. But then you come to the basic, what are they going to do about it? I mean, they'll complain to the ICO. Will that complaint go anywhere? I don't know. They could sue their former employer. I can't imagine you'd want to sue your current employer if you wanted to enjoy promotion prospects in the future. But assuming you wanted to sue your employer, your former employer, yep, that's possible. You're going to be £10,000 in before you even really get started with that. But what do you achieve as an output from that? I think you need to have a real defined idea about what you're going to get from that lawsuit, rather than just showing that your privacy rights were infringed and you didn't quite understand the full extent of the scanning that took place. So it's a bit of a nil-sum game for me, I think, for the employee. I think the better approach is, if you're worried about your personal privacy, and many people quite rightly should be, don't have your stuff on your work devices. I mean, that's the simple advice.
So is that very much along the lines of Scott McNealy, who was the chief executive of Sun Microsystems, was famously quoted in the early 2000s of "privacy is over, get over it." Because I think actually you're sort of arguing that this is going to happen anyway, and as an employee, if you're concerned about it, the cost of fighting it is just not worth it.
Yeah, I think it's dead, and actually it's dying more quickly, because if you speak to we're of a certain age on this panel, I dare to suggest, but if you speak to the youngsters, they have no idea what we're talking about. I mean, half their life is on, I was going to say Facebook, but they're too cool for Facebook now. All their life is on TikTok and Snapchat and similar. And so some of these antiquated views about privacy are just for us old people. So if I'm an evil corporate, I'm just going to dig in, because I think that this risk will pass over time, and people will just accept that your company scan your stuff, and you want to have secrets or personal life, different device.
So Peter, how do you feel that feels against your point, your 10 points of privacy, that really sort of starts to impact on your sort of areas of freedom of thought, not having to explain, vulnerability, but it just seems like, well, you just have to get over that.
Yeah, indeed. And I imagine anyone who was genuinely taking my position in the real world would feel much the same. So what other recourse do I have if I'm that individual? Possibly to attempt some sort of whistleblower position. I can't think of anything in the press at the moment that might sort of correspond to that might be interesting. Maybe I need to approach someone like the Good Law Project and see whether they might be willing to take my case, but I'm not sure whether they have enough time dealing, as they are, with the current scurrilous bunch that they're dealing with. Oh no, that was a personal opinion. So, so I think maybe I would be inclined to attempt to take a whistleblowing approach, which, as Ashley indicated in a parallel topic, could well result in me not continuing with my current employment with any great happiness. But maybe I feel strongly enough about it that I'll take that risk. But beyond that, I think, I can take these academic views, but whether I can actually do anything about it in our society other than to use it against itself and to deploy a whistleblowing or try and encourage a newspaper to blow up my story, don't know.
Well, there's two things you say. Let's just unpick that slightly. Just for legal accuracy, I think I would split off whistleblowing from legal action. So whistleblowing That really works better if you are a position of responsibility in the business. And that's certainly something you can do. And often you will get employee protection from your whistleblowing activities, particularly if you're a data protection officer. So that's one route. But you mentioned actually something that does get me a bit worried, which is going to the Good Law Project or other essentially consumer organizations that might bring claims. Because as the evil corporate, I do get worried, as I mentioned in my introduction, about class action claims. So if you found in the business something that affected a wide range of employees and all in the same way, and had a real kind of effect, not just kind of moral outrage, but preferably a financial effect or show real damages or was prying into sensitive areas like CCTV in the toilets or so on and so forth. If you can find that sort of issue, then you might be able to get a class action running against your former employer. And that's a real risk for me now, because these class actions are horrible. They're really expensive to defend. And if, heaven forfend, I don't defend it successfully, you know, I've got potentially a reasonable amount of damages, say £500 per employee, which for a large organization could be a bigger sum of money, plus my legal costs, plus your legal costs. You know, it's a big bill if I don't prevail on these class actions. So that is a risk for me.
So just starting to look at the questions now that are coming in, and there's a lot of statements in there, so I'm really looking for questions rather than statements. But we've been through some of the roles, and we talked about these big bad corporates, but now let's think about the really good corporate that's trying to do the right thing. And so I'm now the data protection officer, or I'm the General Counsel that really wants to try and do things properly. And we've talked a lot about this evening about privacy. But one of the comments makes that the phrase privacy is actually really hard to define, that it focuses on the US principle of tort law, whereas GDPR uses the terminology data protection and defines responsibilities of the data controller to protect data. So are we using the word privacy when actually we ought to be talking about data protection?
Well, I'll let me deal with that. Sounds like it's a kind of a nerdy question in my kind of lawyer's domain. And so, yes, we have been using the word quite loosely. There are, of course, two things under European law. One is data protection rights under the GDPR. And secondly, is privacy rights, which you need to think of as terms of a kind of a human right. So you put it in the same category as, you know, freedom of speech and right to a fair trial and so on and so forth. And one of the interesting things about there's a rather famous case by a gentleman called Max Schrems. And in his first case, one of the really interesting things was that he reminded everybody that the right of privacy, that second variety, is in fact a fundamental right in European law, and he could use it as a sword, essentially, in his case. So yeah, absolutely two different things. However, that was a few years ago. We are now in a post-Brexit world, and that European fundamental right is very much softened now in the UK. So you might find it very hard now to bring another Schrems type case in the UK, because privacy can really only be used as a shield. By that I mean, if there is government law that says, you know, we do something awful to you, and as a result it impacts on your privacy, you can use that to complain about the law, but you can't use privacy to bring a case in the same way it was before. So the privacy thing is different, but it's now weaker in the UK post-Brexit. But for the purposes of easy conversation, I think that Peter and I are just using the word privacy to mean the combination of privacy and data protection rights.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just reading. Yeah, so There's a question here. I'll come back to some of the others in a moment, skipping over a few. But one a very specific, again, perhaps legally question. How do we mitigate against the US Patriot Act? For example, when we're using cloud services where the US are unable to look at our personal data stored in those cloud services, even though we're over here in Europe.
Well, let's. I think we can probably answer this one in the same style of our debate before. Let me take the view of the evil corporate here. Well, look, if I'm an American corporate, I am subject to the Patriot Act, and so therefore, if the US government comes to see me and says, "Can I have information?" I'm required to provide it. It's my lawful duty to do so, and so. As many on this call might know, because of Max Schrem's other case, Schrem's 2, let's call it, there is now this focus on the situation where data might go from Europe to the US and then, subject to a lawful request, might get passed wholesale to the US government. And now what is required is everybody, and I mean everybody, are required to do these rather complicated transfer assessments to assess whether that's a risk or not. And the answer is yes. So back to my view of evil corporate. I need to do these transfer assessments for every single transfer to the US. I'm looking around in the marketplace and I'm not sure I'm seeing my competitors doing those assessments yet. Because what I really can't bear to happen is to do the assessment and to find out that I cannot transfer data to the US. That would be like a terrible result for my business. And so, maybe what's happening in the world of evil corporate is we're slightly sitting on our hands, hoping for things to get better. Some new treaty or accord might come into play, before having to do this huge weight of really tricky assessments. And if the one to the US was not tricky enough, I've got to do them to every country that I transfer data to internationally, pretty much. It's a difficult job. And just to add to the complexity, the questions in the assessments are not about, does America have privacy law like GDPR? That's not the questions. The questions are, is there lawful intercept requirements under American law? What right does a foreigner have to bring a case against the FBI, say, in the States? Generally none. These sorts of difficult questions you have to answer. So, it's a tough challenge. And so maybe I should just follow the sheep as an evil corporate and just sit on my hands for a bit.
Okay, I'm conscious of time because we have about 10 minutes left. So I am very much scanning through the questions because we won't have time to get to everyone. But this one comes back to that sort of privacy point, but also brings in that consequence point. Please bear, this is quite a long question, but as a certain minority, I'm worried about my personal data being harvested by the wrong party, which could put my career prospects at risk, or could even physically put me in danger. So considering people like this and people in other similar situations, for example, someone in a witness protection scheme, at what point does the risk of consequence become too large? And how could a corporation account for every individual sort of personal cases in this situation?
What can I say? I think the answer is they can't. And I think that's kind of underpins my whole argument as I presented it, that, if you are treating with an organization that's providing a social networking platform or something, then it's your decision, even if it's in ignorance. But if your employer or someone you have a contract with is sharing information that could result in the same sort of net effect, then I, as that employee, would be jolly upset, I should say. Whether there's anything I can do about it, other than what we've already spoken about, I'm not sure. But I would certainly be keen to get expert advice and perhaps get some charitable support, shall we say, to pursue that if I felt I was in that certain minority and potentially a victim.
So I think that there's a couple of stages of the view of evil corporates here. I think for the normal uncaring corporate, it's not so much the data that's made available that's the concern, it's really the consequences. So if that individual does suffer from discrimination or something other unlawful happens to them, actually there's lots of laws that might be transgressed by the corporate. They should certainly bring action against the corporate for. On the data bit, I think that your average evil corporate is kind of, knows that if it does something wrong with the data, that it'll be in trouble. But actually, should it have particular protections around collecting the data, then I'm not sure they're going to get very engaged by that. My argument breaks down a bit, actually, because AI, of course, allows corporates to assess a large amount of data automatically. And as a result of that, you can certainly pull out details of certain minorities and others really easily. And so that looks like a slightly difficult sort of a question. Now, the law does say you're supposed to provide details of transparency and how the logic of AI works. And we have more AI laws coming in Europe, but not in the UK, a couple of years down the line. But there, I think that for evil corporate, I just think you might just assume the risk. For a better behaved corporate, this sounds like an excellent sort of an area in which to set up an ethics board or similar and start to consider some of these additional risks.
The very final question that I'll raise, again, conscious of time, but this is someone that says it's a real scenario, and it is very similar to that this person's company uses a social media platform to contact staff and to share general communications about the retail store that they work in. Their manager put a post on that social media platform asking for volunteers to cover a shift at short notice. This person ignored the post, but the manager disciplined them because he could see that they were on the social media platform at the time rather than working. So is this an invasion of privacy? Is this a case of social profiling? Again, how do you manage that delicate balance between using social media for corporate purposes, but then the company abusing that to say, well, what are you doing on social media?
Well, from my point of view, I'd say, if I were a union rep in that organization, I'd want to know very clearly whether this was part of the contractual relationship between the employees and the employer, or is it something that's just been, that's come about through convenience, in which case I think that in either case, there'd be a significant opportunity to complain, I would have thought. But I'll leave that to the lawyer.
Well, I mean, obviously, if I'm a company and I'm using Facebook for communications, then I can't complain when my employees are on Facebook, looking for communications. And I think that if she complains, then which she perhaps should do, then that's going to get that'll be discovered. I think what I would say is that often case there are more factors to these sorts of puzzles than immediately appear, and so if ever advising on this, you need to have a look at the full set of factors. And then lastly, with my hat as evil corporate on, well, look, it's a really minor thing, and it's not going to, we're not going to get a breach of GDPR claim running against us as a corporate realistically for this. It's not going to generate constructive dismissal or go to a tribunal. I just think as an evil corporate, it just gets lost in the noise of assumed risk, unfortunately. And much as it's sad for Tony Smith's friend, but it's just one of those things that gets lost in that kind of noise band. That's how I think they'll view it.
So again, very conscious of time and needing to finish on time. So I don't think we've got any more questions, but I don't know if there's any sort of final comment either of you would like to make. While I give you a few seconds to think about it, I think it's been an interesting discussion that Peter very much started from a position of that there are some really good reasons why I need to keep my information, or I respect my privacy and I want to maintain my privacy. Ashley, you sort of outlined then, well, actually there's real value in this data, and corporate are trading that to offer us free services. And I think to some extent a lot of people understand that transaction. It's when that transaction happens to start working in your own enterprise, the company that you work in, that to me that the lines get really blurred and it gets a lot more complicated. And that's where I think we spent quite a bit of this discussion, and those questions led us into that role in that corporate world. So yeah, I don't, Peter, have you got any final comments you'd like to make?
Well, I think if I put my real hat on, I'd say, my experience is that speaking to people, some of my pro bono work in teaching about cybersecurity to the community rather than to knowledgeable corporates highlights that people don't actually think about the transaction they're making. For many years, I've taught, you think this service is free, but actually you're exchanging your privacy for it. And not the young people, I agree with Ash's observation, but older people very often haven't thought about that at all. And I think that's something it would be appropriate to try and educate people on a little more, just so they understand better what they're doing when they sign up for a service. And the other thing that we haven't touched on really, because it's slightly out of context, my biggest concern is the use of social media platforms, particularly, especially where companies are encouraging their employees to use the social media platform for everyday communication, is the way that those social media platforms can be utilized to influence mindsets in a very serious and worrying way. I would have hoped that organizations, rather than individuals, sort of thought about that in a little more detail, and maybe give second thoughts as to whether they want to use those platforms for everyday business communication, given the other impact that the employees might suffer.
So,
look, Ashley,
yeah, by reply, I mean, I think that for me, I'm still convinced that companies should make money off your personal data, collectively all your personal data. It's a good business. Our competitors are doing it, and you should do it more. But you need to make sure that you do it with an eye to that risk balance. How much compliance you're going to take, again, how much risk you're going to assume. And what I do take from Peter's good observations today is actually the risk balance needs to be a more thoughtful exercise than it perhaps was in prior years. There are certainly activities that corporates do now that are riskier than they think, and perhaps others are less risky than they think, and therefore that the risk balance is not just, this is my attitude towards privacy risk, my enterprise, this is my point of assumed risk for each type of activity that I'm going to undertake. And perhaps some of the things we talked about, such as scanning of emails, the risk balance might move up. We need better compliance. And in other areas, it might go down. But you do need to be more thoughtful, I think, to be able to properly exploit data to your benefit and to the ultimate benefit of your consumers. It needs a more complicated and thoughtful risk analysis. That's my takeaway.
Thank you. Well, we are now over time. So, yeah, just like to take this opportunity on behalf of CISEC and the BCS to offer our thanks to Peter and Ashley for a very informative discussion. There's certainly quite a few comments and things like that on the chat. Unfortunately, the time didn't allow us to discuss them all, but it certainly showed we had an engaged audience. So yeah, I'd like to thank you all both very much. Unfortunately, one of the challenges of this platform is we can't do it by the usual token of a sort of a round of applause, but especially when everyone's muted. But I'm sure if they weren't muted, you would get a very, very generous round of applause. So thank you very much. I don't know whether either Paul or Matt want to do some final comment from a BCS perspective.
I was going to say thank you. A very good debate, and I think Matt's already put a point in the chat about our next event, which is in November, covering enterprise architecture. But thank you very much for everyone attending.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone.